Greetings, everybody. Welcome to Armor of Truth Live number 335. On July 30th of this year, a new book was released titled Shepherds for Sale: How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. This book is written by Basham. She writes for The Daily Wire. She's also written for World Magazine. Point being, she's a writer familiar with evangelical circles and has written in that space for a while. The book critically examines the influence of progressive ideologies on evangelical leaders, and I mean big influences. And it's not really debatable that these influences don't have the best interests of Christians in mind. And that's going to be part of the debate that's central here tonight, as I'm going to be mentioning also, excuse me, of course I lost. Here it is. Gavin Ortlund, the California pastor. I think he's located in Ojai. And he shows up in Megan's book. And I want to tell you exactly how he shows up in the book as we get to that in a minute. But what I want to start off the bat is this video is specifically intended to speak directly to Gavin Ortlund. It's my hope, it's my prayer that Gavin Ortlund would see this and would receive this message that I want him to hear, and by extension also anyone else in the church who feels like the climate change movement is something I need to be a part of. In fact, if you're feeling like it's a first order issue, it's tied to the gospel, because you're not loving people well. You're not loving your neighbor if you're not doing everything you can to stop global warming, because that's the message that's coming through. Many beloved evangelical leaders have compromised on doctrine in exchange for political and social influence. This is a scorching topic these days. Gavin has had to respond to this quite a bit already, and that this is one of his response videos, the thumbnail for it. Basham's book caught a lot of attention right out of the gate because of the subject matter, for sure, becoming a bestseller, creating a swarm of discussion, and unsurprisingly sparking the kind of bad behavior typical on social media platforms. Basham has been everywhere over the past couple weeks. I would suggest, if you'd like to see an interview with her, check out Conversations That Matter YouTube channel, podcast. John Harris interviewed her recently, and he's done a couple shows about this, and you can get more background from him on this, because my purpose here tonight is not to get involved in that back and forth. I don't want to be a part of that. I've got a different message. I want to speak directly to Gavin Ortlund and anyone like him, anyone who feels like he feels, or anyone who's been influenced by this climate change narrative. I've read Megan Basham's book, paying particular attention to the chapter 2 on climate change, and the 7 or so pages that mention Dr. Gavin Ortlund, which primarily focus on a video he posted to his Truth Unites YouTube channel on March 2nd, 2022, titled Climate Change: Why Christians Should Engage. Let me go ahead and play that clip. I'm going to play a clip from Protestia. I can't go through all of Gavin's video here because I want this to be short enough that there'd be a chance that he might see it. But We will play this clip from Protestia, which sort of summarizes what he says, and I want to do my best to present his position accurately. All right.
Now, I have been misrepresented before. My YouTube channel is mainly focused on apologetics and theology and things like that. So I want to talk about climate change. And I have 5 things to say from a Christian perspective particularly. I care about it so much, I think we can't not talk about it. It's just too important. The climate affects everything. Now, it is true, as people often point out, that climate change is extremely common and kind of severe throughout Earth's history. So you can go back to times, I think it was like around 50 million years ago, there's basically no ice anywhere. And you've got, islands near the North Pole with huge trees, and the annual mean temperature at the North Pole 50 million years ago is 60 degrees Fahrenheit.
I would start off with that point. Now we have, within the Christian community, within the church, believers, the believing church. I consider Gavin Ortlund to be that. He's a brother. I don't doubt that. But of course, there are 2 competing perspectives on whether or not the Genesis narrative is a literal telling of creation, or whether it's somehow the idea that theistic evolution, that in fact we have evolved from single-celled organisms. In fact, that would mean we've evolved essentially from inanimate matter, from inorganic material, which that's a different show. I think the Stand to Reason channel on YouTube is a great place if you want to hear those debates. And we're talking about climate change, so I think it's not insignificant that he shows his hand here that he's certainly a theistic evolutionist, and he's not shy about that. He's been in a back and forth with Ken Ham earlier this year for a couple videos back and forth about that. So I just want to put that out there, because it is my position that if you affirm that the earth is billions of years old, your perspective on climate change and is going to be affected by that in some way. Because if it's not, then everything you're saying about the ice caps 50 million years ago is irrelevant. But let's skip that for now.
And then you can find other times where there's ice ages and it's really, really cold. So the temperature does vary naturally. It's just good to observe, first of all, that there is pretty much a scientific consensus, or a very close to a scientific consensus on human-caused climate change.
Now, I'm going to be coming back to that, and I'm going to be responding primarily to that claim there, because that's really what's in question here. So we'll come back to that in a moment. Let's hear the rest of this.
As a very real problem. If you're going to go against a near consensus in the scientific community, study it and make sure that that's a wise thing to do, because I see a lot of people reacting instinctively rather than really hitting the books. And I don't think that that's a responsible posture for Christians to take. Basic idea of climate change is not only extremely well supported in the scientific community, it's also very intuitive and commonsensical and basic. You've got a lot more people alive today. Going back to the principles of just basic wisdom and planning, we have to think about, how do we do that? How do we manage that? Where might
principles of basic wisdom and planning. We're going to come back to that point in just a moment as well, because I couldn't agree with him more. But our foundations have to be sure.
That put a strain on resources and so forth. And here's the main problem. It's not the number of human beings, though that can contribute to what is the main problem, and that's the technological advances since the Industrial Revolution have dramatically altered how we relate to the environment. And to put it really simply, we have forms of technology that consume huge amounts of what are called fossil fuels. So sources of energy like coal.
Fossil fuels. I'll be dealing directly with the claim that fossil fuels are the catalyst. Fossil fuels are the problem. Fossil fuels are what are causing the problem, because fossil fuels create CO2. CO2 is what's warming up the atmosphere and causing the warming and causing the oceans to boil eventually, is one of the claims. We'll come back to that.
Natural gas, petroleum, things like this. And we use these to power our cars and our homes and our airplanes and so forth. And in so doing, they emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, especially carbon dioxide. Huge increases in emissions of greenhouse gases. The reason that's a problem is because, first of all, greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere forever, practically. But basically, they trap more heat energy from the sun. So it's like putting more blankets on at night. You can observe the greenhouse effect at the local level. Very easy. It's not in dispute as such. From 2007 on, every other scientific body.
So this question that the greenhouse effect is not even in question, well, not true. That's not true. It is in question. It is not settled science. We'll come back to that.
Of national or international standing agrees that human-caused global warming is a serious problem. So
that consensus is scientists of a certain ilk, scientists of a certain degree, scientists that are at least approved. Right? How do we get to truth? How do we know what's true? Is consensus a measure of truth? We'll get back to that.
The level of conspiracy and hoax it would be if somehow all of these different people think that scientists are all together. People have this distrust of science. Science is an inherently conservative process, and these people are not all in cahoots with each other. If somebody could disprove this.
We'll deal with that claim directly. It says they're not all in cahoots together. I don't think they're all in cahoots together either. But how should we as Christians think about that very issue? Wow, all these experts do appear to be in agreement on something. Is that really the case? Is that really what's happening? And we'll also deal with where is Gavin getting his information from? Because like Gavin, I'm not a scientist, but look, we don't have to have experts to tell us everything. We can figure some things out. We can tell whether or not we're being lied to. We can tell whether or not something is true to a reasonable level of certainty. So where does your information come from? Who are you trusting to tell you about CO2, about fossil fuels being the culprit, about the fact that the United States is the main offender? Who are you trusting to give you that? Is it not disputed?
There'd be much incentive to do that. And yet you have so much agreement in the scientific community. And some of the things are obvious, like you think of sea level rise. Other things you may not think of right away. But even just sea level rise is a big deal. 11 out of the 15 largest cities in the world are on coastal estuaries. So you can see this happening already. It's not like a distant hypothesis. You see it happening in places like New Orleans or Venice. You also have more intense hurricanes because they...
Is that true? What's the data? What is the data that says we have more intense hurricanes, that we have more and more intense hurricanes? Where's the data? And let's just say that the sea is rising in some place. What is the cause? Why is it the assumption that fossil fuels and CO2 are what's causing that? Why?
Are fueled by the warmer waters in the summer. You have more wildfires, which I live in Southern California. I can tell you how devastating those are, partly because of drought, but also because of drier air.
Partly because of drought, but also because of drier air. There are other factors, and they come from the climate change movement. The environmentalists, what we call here the fake environmentalist movement in California a lot of the maintenance to the forest that was done for decades, back cutting, thinning in certain areas so that if a fires are normal. Fires are natural. They're a natural occurrence in a place like California and on the earth. Forest fires happen. Now sometimes they're arson, but these things, this is part of the environment, it's part of the process. And so one of the ways that forest fires, wildfires were mitigated, the effects of them would be mitigated, the damage could be controlled while nature is allowed to run its course, would be the back cutting, creating breaks, and I'm going to get too far down that rabbit hole. But it's not just the dry area, it's not just the climate, it's not only the climate. Wildfires can, when they start now, can spread farther because these things aren't done as much anymore because of we have to stay out of the forest. We need to not do these things because they damage the forest and the environment.
The oceans become more acidic as ice melts and other forms of pollution. Richer countries like the United States, which we consume so much per capita, it's embarrassing how much we consume. We won't face the direct effects as much probably as other places in the world. If you are pro-life, you should care about climate change, because when there is a drought or a famine in a poor country, people die. The particular beliefs of Christianity, the particular worldview that is inculcated by the Christian gospel, is one that should naturally incline us to care about issues of stewardship and sustainability and responsible usage of resources and things like that. I'm just deeply concerned that there is an anti-science mentality that evangelicals often have. And then there's just basic principles that all Christians believe in that play into an issue like climate change, wisdom in planning for the future, opposition to greed, contentment and valuing simplicity and modesty of lifestyle. You think of Proverbs 38, which says, "Give me neither poverty nor riches." Second of all, the basic principle of love your neighbor. Issues of environmental stewardship and particularly climate change have been.
The principles of love your neighbor. That's big. You'll hear this later when we get into Basham's book, the idea that we have to engage in climate change. In fact, Dr. Ortlund says that Christians need to lead in climate change because that ultimately it's connected to the gospel. That makes it a first order issue. That means if you're not doing it, you're not faithful. Well, what is loving your neighbor? Speaking the truth in love? What is the truth? What is the truth? Do we know? Can we know? Is it even possible for us to know the truth on this? I think it is. I think it is possible.
Been associated with political liberalism, and evangelicals have tended to be politically conservative. And I think that is the biggest single factor for why more Christians aren't more active in kind of leading the charge on something like climate.
Because politics. I can tell you one thing. If I didn't have to register one way or the other in my state to be able to vote in primaries, I wouldn't be registered as Democrat or Republican. That's a weak argument. I understand there are a lot of people who do make their decisions that way, but that's painting with a broad brush. We'll come back.
Climate change. And I'm not trying to scare people with this. That's not the motive, but it's just trying to be accurate. And we need to understand what a big deal this is. I just think that a big part of how we're going to make progress is spreading more knowledge and making this more of just something that's out on the table that we're thinking about, that we're aware of. Now,
Amen.
I'm aware that that's not all we need to do, of course. In fact, that's one tiny thing compared to everything we need to do. If people would just, do some research about it and then have an opinion, that alone is, because all change starts in the hearts and minds of people. It just seems like it's one of those issues that should be way high on the level of urgency.
Okay. This is an issue that should be way high.
Huge trees and.
Okay. Look, all right, I don't like what's going on in social media. It makes me uncomfortable. I don't like the fact that Megan Basham and Gavin Ortlund are going back and forth, and or that it seems right. There's a, I don't know if I had it. There was a graphic that someone had made, you know, who. Well, it just I don't have it here, but it said who's the liar? Who is the liar? Well, Gavin in the video, he said, can we just talk about this? Can we just put it on the table, please? I say, yes, please, let's talk about it. I agree with him on this. And I agree with Gavin, I agree with Megan, that we should talk about this. And my wife, Summer, is of the same mind, too. We definitely need to talk about this. We're in this is, if some of you may be watching this for the first time, we are Armor of Truth. We're a Christian media organization, and which means we do ministry work because we lead with the gospel. And so I agree that we need to love our neighbor. I agree with I think that Gavin Ortlund and Megan Basham should be talking about this publicly. They should do it publicly because, look, if we're Christians, that means we're different. We don't handle conflict the same way everyone else does. Jesus commanded his disciples to love one another, and by application, Jesus has commanded the same of us, that we should love one another. Specifically, Jesus is saying that Christians, his followers, must love one another and demonstrate it publicly, because immediately after that charge made by the Lord, He tells his disciples why we must do this. And it goes beyond just because it's good. It's because when we live out our faith, when we actively gospel one another, speaking the truth in love, and when we demonstrate sacrificial love for the community of faith, then we will look different than the rest of the world. And the world will take notice because we will shine like a brilliant light in the midst of a dark world. And this is sacrificial, right? Because our instinct is, no, I'm going to stand my ground over here. Sacrificial love is the lighthouse for all those lost at sea, who God is drawing to the safety of his harbor. And so I wanted to make those points clear, that I really do. I really do love and appreciate Gavin Ortlund as a brother in Christ, and in the ministry work that we do here. For those of you who are new, my wife and I work in this together. Her name is Summer, and there she is. She's not on the show with us tonight. She was traveling today. But second to fulfilling the Great Commission, it's crucial for myself that I keep myself informed about current events, that I keep my defense of the faith sharp, because the world is more hostile to Christians than ever before. And I mean, when I say that, I mean in a broader sense. Gavin Ortlund's work, particularly in apologetics, has been a tremendous benefit to me personally. His apologetics to Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, excellent. He teaches an approach called theological triage, where he helps viewers learn how to keep a faithful posture, and that's his language, keep a faithful posture in apologetics and evangelism. We don't need to separate the two. And to avoid unnecessary disfellowship by thoughtfully categorizing theological disagreements according to first, second, and third order issues. Is this a salvation issue? Is this an issue that we should break fellowship over? I think that's a useful approach. So I want to use that approach. I want to approach this issue in such a way that Dr. Ortlund could appreciate it if he should happen to see this. We're very small here. The way we talk about issues seems to, get us in trouble with YouTube quite a bit. But aside from all that, I want to approach this in a way that Dr. Ortlund would appreciate it, because it's not my intention to talk about Gavin Ortlund. More than anything else, I want to talk to you, brother. I believe that if I'm respectful of his approach to apologetics, that my argument against his position stands a much better chance of being received with the intention in which it's being given. And my intention is to appeal to Dr. Ortlund and all of those who are compelled to believe this way about climate change, the climate change movement. I want to appeal to you all to reconsider your position on this. Not because climate change is a hoax, not because I'm anti-science, but because the foundational claim of the whole movement is false. It's false. That means that Dr. Ortlund's reason for promoting the movement as one that Christians should be leading is likewise flawed at its foundation. And if the foundation is destroyed, what can the righteous do? Now, in the video, in the clip we just watched earlier, Gavin says, I'm not a scientist. I'm just trying to do my best. I concur. I'm not a scientist either, but I want to suggest something right here. I don't need to be a scientist to evaluate. We don't have to rely on so-called experts for everything or in order to make up our minds on what is true or false. Technocrats govern by scientific dictatorship. I don't know if you've looked around lately. That's where our world is headed fast. Technocrats govern by scientific dictatorship, but they do not appeal to science. They appeal to scientism. And in this context, that means the use of scientific language and appeals to authority rather than objective evidence and data. This is why you can't have a debate on this in the public square. You just get shouted down. It's like trying to have a debate on gay marriage. It's not allowed. Christians are certainly called to be good stewards of the good earth, but we're also commanded to know what time it is, to discern the spirit of the age in which we live. That means we have to be aware of anyone that might be willing to deceive us and perhaps take advantage of our desire to please the Lord. Do you think that the devil might take advantage of an issue like this to divide the church? So if we don't rightly discern the times in which we live, we might miss the fact that we live squarely in the center of a cultural revolution, where the same kinds of tactics used in Mao's Cultural Revolution, the same tactical use of environmental issues being used as a cudgel to force the masses in a certain direction, that we're seeing in Vladimir Lenin's regime. So as Christians, we need to remember this. How does something work its way into the church? How does something that's not a first order issue work its way into the church and become a first order issue? First, they ignore evil. Then they permit evil. Then they legalize evil. Then they promote evil. Then they celebrate evil. Sorry about that. Then they celebrate evil. And then they persecute those who still call it evil. That's pretty much Romans 1, I think. 18 through 32. Isaiah 5:20 says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil." Isaiah also said, the Lord said through Isaiah, "Come and let us reason together." So for many years, our ministry has been involved particularly in discussing this issue, climate change. The claims made by its advocates, we critique the inconsistencies in what is so often referred to as the science, and we're trying our best to understand from where the idea and the official narrative of it originates, and whether or not it is a legitimate issue. And if there is any possibility that the topic and the anxiety that this issue creates is being used for any nefarious purpose. So I want to avoid piling on Gavin. I'm not here to defend Megan Basham's book or to take a side in that heated dispute. It's probably impossible not to take a side on that. There's really no neutrality in such a thing, I don't believe, but I just don't like how people are handling themselves I'm just talking about the general lurkers on social media. So, where do I disagree? I disagree with Dr. Ortlund's position on climate change as an issue that Christians should be leading on. I don't even think we should be involved in it. I also disagree with the assertion that resistance to climate change, the official narrative, necessarily comes from an anti-science bias or is held by those who haven't hit the books and studied the topic before commenting on it. I disagree with that assessment. I would resent that assessment too if it was said directly to me, because it's certainly not true of myself or my wife, Summer, we're in this stuff all the time. Shamefully, probably, too much. But the same claim, check it out. Now, is this not true? When one says to you about those of us who reject the climate change movement, they say, well, that's mostly because of, you haven't really hit the books. You haven't really studied the issue all that well. Well, the same claim could be made in the opposite direction. It's also possible that those who affirm and repeat the official narrative are doing so without hitting the books. If our duty is to be discerning and reasonable, to seek justice and to speak the truth in love on these issues, shouldn't we be willing to consider that it's possible, given the institutional prestige and power behind it, and perhaps that it's even more common, given the political polarization, that many of those who proselytize the science do so without ever really investigating the claims too deeply. So at this point, I don't think it's controversial at all to assert that the corporate media and marketing agencies who shape public discourse are not reliable, and they do not have your best interest in mind, especially for the Christian church. I also disagree with the proposition that consensus is an accurate measure of truth anywhere, but especially in science, especially on issues like fossil fuels and global warming and climate change and global average temperature and anything that has to do with expanding government or institutional authority over the people. So I want to make a disclaimer here. My skepticism as an outsider, someone who's not an expert in climate science anyway, is not based on the belief that the experts who have been researching in their fields of study for decades are making mistakes in their research. I want to make that clear. I'm not saying that the experts are getting it wrong. What's happening is that the system that's responsible for reporting to us what experts think is broken, and in many cases severely distorting the data to shape a false reality. One that serves special interest groups, lobbies, corporate cronies, and the kind of people who will do almost anything to maintain their position of power, right up to depopulation. Now, if we know that this is happening, if we're even aware that it's possible that the IPCC could be doctoring the data, and if we can demonstrate that the International Panel on Climate Change, the official gatekeeper of the consensus science, the one that Gavin referred to, if we can demonstrate that their consensus science is compromised in any way, then with all due respect to Gavin Ortlund, who referred to the IPCC to support his argument, and all the other evangelical leaders pushing creation care, well, then loving our neighbor would look a lot more like exposing these institutions for their misconduct and their deceptive, anti-Christian, anti-human policies, rather than compelling our neighbors and congregations to get behind it, support it, and in fact lead it. Do we want to lead an anti-Christian movement? Well, if we can show that it's at all possible that it is that, we need to reject it. The movement foments despair. So please understand, the spirit behind the movement intends to make you feel anxious, to make you feel despair. So you'll get mad at someone and demand someone do something. Specifically, white people of privilege in the United States. Models that create fear, marshaling of data to foment anxiety, and a massive marketing campaign is the primary motivator behind this. Not science, not data. Is the United States the source of global warming? The primary source? Or is it perhaps that the United States is the one contributing the most data? And is that data accurate? And how would we know? At the end of Dr. Ortlund's original video, he says, what if we could all benefit from the polarization that this has caused? And I agree. Let us benefit by learning how to discern what time it is, to discern truth from error. Now, this is a clip, this lady, Catherine Hayhoe, is mentioned in the book. Right here. She's mentioned in this book, Shepherds for Sale. Comes the police again. Oh, it's a fire truck. I want you to listen to this because in chapter 2 of Basham's book, she discusses this a bit. Let me give you a brief introduction. I'll let you hear this first. Listen to Catherine Hayhoe talk about Christianity, the Christian perspective on climate change.
And so for myself as a Christian, part of the reason why I do what I do is because climate change exacerbates humanitarian issues. It is just absolutely not fair when you look at the impact it's having on the poorest and most disenfranchised people in the world. I have a slight handicap. I faint at the sight of blood, so a medical career was out of the question. I figured climate change is the next best thing, right? So people often say, well, how do you talk to people at church? Well, I don't start by pulling out the IPCC reports and whacking people upside the head with them. If we are theological evangelicals, which are people who take the Bible seriously,
Pay close attention to what's being said right here. If you take the Bible seriously, you will get behind the climate change, but you will see this the way I do. If you take the Bible seriously.
Evangelical is a very difficult term to define, so I actually asked the head of the National Association of Evangelicals a couple of years ago, what is your definition? And he said, people who take the Bible seriously. I said, good definition. So if you take the Bible seriously, you know that at the very beginning of the Bible, it talks about how humans have been given responsibility over every living thing on this earth, which includes our brothers and sisters who are less fortunate than us. Then all through the Bible, it talks about God's love and care for creation, for nature. And then it talks a lot about caring for others who are less fortunate than us, the poor, the widows, the orphans, sharing what we have with people in need. And then right at the end of the Bible, there is a zinger that very few people have read. And it specifically says, God will destroy those who destroy the earth. That's the book of Revelation. So there's a lot.
I don't think that's what, in fact, I don't think that's what that's exactly talking about. I don't think it's not exactly exegetically sound, but anyway, do you take the Bible seriously? If you're not behind this movement, you don't take the Bible seriously.
That you can talk about, but in today's world, don't go straight to Revelation, okay? It's at the end for a reason. In today's world, though, the word evangelical is used in a very different way. It's used for political evangelicals. And my definition of a political evangelical is someone whose statement of faith is written first by their political ideology, only a distant second by the Bible, and if the two come into conflict, as they frequently do, they will go with their political ideology over what it says in the Bible.
And so, once again, there's the claim. If you're not behind this movement, it's because you've been politicized. Please, come on now. Let's be honest. Let's be honest about this. Are we saying that the people who are behind you and your movement have not been politicized? Here's another clip.
often people ask me, as some visitors to our church did last year when we went out for lunch with them and they found out that the pastor's wife was a climate scientist, they say, do you believe in global warming? And my answer is no. I said, no, I don't believe in it. And then often...
Now notice the picture. Because the assumption here is that was caused by global warming, right? Of course, this is powerful, right? I think it's disingenuous to use, it's a bit deceptive to use things like this. Like, look at this. Because what does that do? That builds despair, causes some anxiety. Anyway, I'm nitpicking now.
People say, but you're a climate scientist. How do you not believe in it? I said, well, because the Bible tells us what the definition of belief or faith is. In Hebrews, it talks about how faith or belief is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of what we do not see.
Playing fast and loose with the hermeneutics.
Over 2,000 years ago, there was a baby born in a manger. You could see the physical baby, but we could not see with our eyes the fact that he was the Son of God. Yet that's what we...
And that relates to climate change how? That's a stretch. I would say this is what's called theological liberalism.
Believe, isn't it? We could see that baby grew to be a man and died a horrible death on the cross. You could see that with your eyes. But what we could not see, but what we believe, is that he died for the forgiveness of our sins. And then, 3 days later, he rose.
Not the fact that the gospel is true. The fact that he's using this as a foundation to tie it to your involvement, your gospel care of people affected by climate change.
And they could see the empty tomb with their eyes, and they couldn't believe it. They said, what have you done with the body? But what we believe is something truly crazy. We believe that he actually rose again to give us new life, a new spiritual life, taking us from death into life. This is what we believe. If I were back when the author of Hebrews was writing this...
Yeah, but we believe that. We believe that based on some very clear objective truths. There's information. There is a revealed word that reinforces that belief.
This book. If I was back then, I would have jogged their elbow and I would have said, you forgot the second half of the verse. Because the second half of the verse is clearly that science is the substance of things that are here and now, the evidence of what we can observe. So all told, when we look at...
I'm not sure if she's just being hyperbolic there, but I don't think science is in view in that particular passage. But again, this is the message. Again, is here comes some data. If you don't take the Bible seriously, if you're not supporting this,
independent lines of evidence there are that the planet is warming. Yeah.
So this is how it works.
When we look at all of these things in God's creation, do you know how many independent lines of evidence there are that the planet is warming?
There they are. There's the number.
Yeah.
This is defined as scientism. What are they? What are these indicators of a warming planet? And the assumption that what's causing that why these indicators point to a warming planet, it's because of fossil fuels. In fact, it's very specifically because of privileged people in the United States consuming mass quantities of fossil fuels. That's scientism.
So we know that, yes, the planet really is warming. It would be the idea that one of God's greatest gifts to us was the planet. Because not only did Christ come as an actual physical human being to give us new spiritual life, but it was very important that he came as a physical being. And there was a heresy, a Gnostic heresy in the early church, saying that the physical didn't matter. And so the Apostle John wrote very strongly countering this, and he said, we have seen with our eyes, we have touched with our hands. Jesus was real, he was physical. So would we consider that perhaps the planet, which is the perfect home for life, is one of the greatest gifts that God has given us?
I would say so, yeah. It's a perfect home for life. And God sustains it by the word of his power every moment. So let me move on from this so we can get through this in a reasonable amount of time. So we want to use the same approach that we would in apologetics. What does one believe? Why does one believe it? Which means we assess and challenge presuppositions. 1 Thessalonians 5:21 says, test everything and hold fast to that which is good. It means a thoughtful, critical approach to discerning truth from error. To be able to discern when someone is throwing a statistic at you and saying, that means this, without ever telling you the this. Or, implying it always. The presupposition, what is a presupposition? It's an underlying assumption or belief that is taken for granted without being explicitly stated or argued for. Something that is assumed to be true. These underlying assumptions are how a person makes sense of the world. It's their belief system. It's their, or you could call it their worldview. And everybody has one. The question is whether or not that belief system is coherent. Meaning, is it logical? Is it consistent? Do the claims agree with one another? Is it well organized? And as Christians, we're commanded to be critical thinkers and to expose darkness, lies, and harmful deceptions. And it is my position that what Ms. Hayhoe is presenting, I'm not saying she's being deceptive. She may truly believe and be convinced by her conscience of everything she's saying. I would assume that of her. But we're called to be critical thinkers. We're called to call out harmful deceptions. Proverbs 14:15 says the simple or the gullible believes everything, but the prudent gives thought to his steps. And so Christians should be the ones who don't let things like this slip past us. Critical evaluation is essential before accepting something as true. Imagine a person's position about a particular issue as a house. We'll just say it's the position on climate change. Imagine that as a house. Sorry. For example, you might say Christians should be engaged in the climate change movement. That's a position, that's an argument, and it's a house. And so the foundation of this house are those core foundational beliefs that this person takes for granted as true. The walls are the specific claims and the arguments based on those beliefs. The roof represents the conclusions and the decisions, the things we decide to do with ourselves, how we respond to this. Decisions a person will make based on the beliefs that form the walls of their house. And so the roof covers and protects everything inside, just as your conclusions help you to navigate the world based on your underlying beliefs and assumptions. And so if the foundational arguments are flawed, inconsistent, if they contradict one another or are perhaps not objectively true, then that foundation will affect the way those walls, the specific claims, the arguments, are constructed, and as well as the roof or the conclusions. So you could very well, if you have a flawed foundation, flawed belief system, you could very easily head in the wrong direction. You could make poor decisions. If the foundation, your presuppositions, is weak or flawed, the entire house becomes unstable, potentially leading to cracks in the walls or flawed beliefs, or a leaky roof, faulty conclusions. Therefore, just as a well-built house depends on a strong foundation, a coherent argument or position about the climate change movement depends on sound presuppositions. A strong house does not depend on appeals to experts. 26,500, data points. A strong house does not stand or depend on consensus science, or the media, or sad stories, or emotions, or one's politics. In this case, the foundation of a house is made up of many presuppositions about settled or consensus science, the official narrative, appeals to data from models, etc. What can we say about consensus? we can say very plainly, abortion is something that has been arrived at by consensus. Some of the worst ideas in history, like slavery, racism, eugenics, all successfully spread because they were expert consensus. Darwinism. Darwinism is at the heart of some of the worst atrocities we've ever seen. Think Holocaust. So that's what consensus will do for you. It's no measure of truth, but in a modern specialized society, now here's a point I want to make, where we live in these complex systems, and it has benefited so many people and supported the fruitful multiplication of humanity. So how do we rightly and justly consider expert opinion? Experts should be advisors. Experts should not be authorities. Whenever experts become the authorities, you're living in a technocracy. That's a scientific dictatorship. That is the essence of a communist regime. What are some of the presuppositions? For example, fossil fuel consumption is an existential threat. Peak oil is a presupposition. That's the idea that we've already reached. We've got to the point in using our oil, the oil we've drilled and sucked out of the ground. We're running out now. We can see, the end is in sight. That's a presupposition. It's not necessarily true. It's not settled science that oil takes millions of years or even hundreds of thousands of years to be created, to form. It is the most compact, economical, source of energy that the world has ever seen. It's a gift from God. Oil, hydrocarbons, our gift is a gift from God. Okay, so another presupposition, we consume too much fossil fuels. Fossil fuel use is responsible for catastrophic resource depletion, pollution, climate change. As fossil fuel use increased, we've seen a drastic reduction in standard of living, life expectancy. You can just knock that one out right off the bat. Standard of living has increased in a big way since the Industrial Revolution. Life expectancy has increased since the Industrial Revolution. So the evidence seems to be that fossil fuels create circumstances for people to prosper. Not just people in developed nations. Everyone has benefited. Another presupposition or set of presuppositions is to be good stewards of the earth, we must drastically reduce fossil fuel usage, drastically increase our use of renewable energy. It's funny that we seem to hear that quite a bit from those who are invested in renewable energy. In fact, Jonathan Moo in the book, one of the cases was Jonathan Moo, an evangelical who's, let me just jump to that. Jonathan Moo, loving God and neighbor as in an age of climate crisis. So it's built in to the title. There's a climate crisis. It's assumed. That's a presupposition. Jonathan Moo he says, is the Lindemann Chair and Professor of New Testament Environmental Studies at Whitworth University in Spokane, Washington. He's also, it's in the book, I'm not going to look it up now to save time, but he also sits on the board or would benefit directly from, he works for a company or is on the board of a company that directly benefits or profits from something like carbon credits. And he doesn't mind promoting carbon credits when he's giving speech. This is from chapter 2 of Megan Basham's book. So, more presuppositions. We have to drastically increase our use of renewable energy. Another one of the presuppositions is that global average temperature is an exact settled science. And that 1.5 degree mark, that's it. If we hit that, we can't come back from that. There will be irreparable damage done to the earth. And if we get to the 2 degrees Celsius mark, everyone's going to die. I'm not making that up. This is what we see from the IPCC. Another presupposition is that carbon dioxide is a dangerous greenhouse gas. So I'm going to give you a couple. I want to give you a couple resources that you can check on. Pardon me for just a moment while I go grab one. I'll let you listen to the rest of Ms. Hayhoe here.
Give us our physical life, which matters to God so much that his son became a physical human on this planet. And if we believe, as most of us do as Christians, if we believe that God created this planet that we live on, and in fact created this incredible universe that it's placed in, then what is science other than studying God's creation? And how could science possibly be in conflict with what God has created? It even talks about this in Romans. It says, "For ever since the world was created, we've seen the earth and the sky. Through everything God made, we can clearly see what? We can see God. In what? In nature, in creation, through our science." And it even says we have no excuse for not knowing God if we look at his creation. I care about a changing climate is because it does matter to people. It matters to people profoundly.
A lot of claims being made there. First source I want to share with you is Alex Epstein. Is how he says it. Fossil Future. Why global human flourishing requires more fossil fuels, more oil, coal, and natural gas, not less. And that's because human beings have mastery over these substances. Lord has said, take dominion. But taking dominion means that we master these materials, these elements. Fossil Future, Alex Epstein. Now it is detailed, it's dense, and it will essentially debunk all of these presuppositions. If we were to join the movement to eliminate fossil fuels, we would have blood on our hands, as some of the worst ideas in history were successfully spread through this idea of consensus experts. This is what we would call full context thinking. What we're hearing from Ms. Hayhoe is a one-track thinking. The system we rely on today to tell us what experts think is distorted. It is broken. Let's see. One of the presuppositions is that people are dying because of climate change. These reports are distorted. They're deceiving. They omit the crucial fact that climate-related deaths have plummeted in the last 100 years. People say, listen to the scientists. It's almost always used to get us to accept a given policy evaluation without critical thinking. Expert evaluations can lead to anti-human standards of evaluation. The moral case for eliminating fossil fuels is a deeply anti-human argument, and the term climate change is misconstrued as an unequivocal negative. Like it's going to happen regardless. That's the presupposition. By asking, is this evaluation truly considering the full context? And we can protect ourselves against some of the worst policies advocated in the name of the experts. Let's see, there was one fact right here in the beginning that I think is that's useful when we talk about the moral case. Is the narrative true? Fact number one, fossil fuels are still the dominant source of energy around the world. Fact number two, the world has continued to become a better place to live, not worse. Fact three, while fossil fuels have contributed to a warming global climate system, That warming amounts to 1 degree Celsius over the last 170 years. And climate-related disaster deaths continue to fall to all-time lows thanks in large part to fossil-fueled climate mastery. Over the last century, the rate of climate-related disaster deaths has fallen by 98%. So the walls of this house are made up of the moral case for eliminating fossil fuels. And as Alex Epstein has summarized for us in his book, Fossil Future, it usually goes something like this. Carbon dioxide emissions from the world's massive use of fossil fuels are causing catastrophic climate change, including ever worse heat waves, storms, floods, wildfires, and droughts. Catastrophic climate change, along with other negative side effects of fossil fuel use, such as air pollution and water pollution, make us morally obligated to rapidly eliminate fossil fuel use and reach net zero carbon dioxide emissions by the year 2050 at the latest, so as to limit, to prevent the average global temperature from warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, or the absolute most 2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial, pre-fossil fuel temperatures. What will replace fossil fuels? Of course, it will be green, renewable energy, solar and wind energy, especially solar and wind, which are already rapidly replacing fossil fuels at lower cost, this is the argument, and with sufficient political will, can soon power the whole world. Now, that's a false notion. The only people who oppose the rapid elimination of fossil fuels and its replacement by green energy are deniers and delayers, as we heard from Dr. Ortlund, people who deny science. Above all, the fossil fuel industry, right, the oil industry, who are placing their short-term convenience and profits above people and the planet. The moral case for eliminating fossil fuels is not portrayed as one competing view among many. This is what full context thinking. This is how you know you're listening to someone, or you're listening to an argument that has something up its sleeve, because it's not one of many competing views. It's portrayed as the near unanimous consensus of experts by a wide variety of trusted sources. Who are these trusted sources? Leading news institutions like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the BBC, the spokespeople of numerous public scientific institutions, above all, the prestigious United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. The spokespeople of every major government around the world, all of whom have signed on to the Paris Climate Agreement, which calls for the rapid elimination of fossil fuel use to prevent climate catastrophe. And, of course, the leaders of leading financial institutions like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and corporations like Apple, Alphabet, or Google, and name them, they're all there, who have all signed on to the net zero or the 100% renewable pledges, claiming that they are moral and practical. So, when so many trusted sources are telling us that there's an expert consensus for fossil fuel, how do you argue with that? Right? It might be hard to imagine the moral case for eliminating fossil fuels isn't at least basically right, right? At least it's got to be partly right. I mean, not completely lying, are they? There's no way all these experts could be totally wrong. And so it may feel like the safe and morally superior position to oppose fossil fuels, to even, in fact, it's part of the argument, to oppose people of privilege, in fact. It might feel right. It might feel moral to fight against the prosperity of privileged people who are doing all this damage to the environment and causing famines and wars and forcing the poor people from the countries most affected by climate change to flee to developed and prosperous colonial Western nations who do not deserve their wealth. This is all part of the climate change narrative, folks. I understand why many people who simply don't have the time to research this would be easily convinced to take up the cause of the poor and to fight against Western hegemony, to save the planet. It's a strong argument, right? I mean, it's a rah-rah moment. It can get you fired up. Well, here's the question. This isn't new. This movement is over 60 years old, and these experts have been saying this the whole time. Let's see. Paul Ehrlich. Let's see if I got him here. Yeah, Paul Ehrlich. Were the experts right about fossil fuels, carbon dioxide, and global warming? Let's listen to Kamala, her quote from last week here too, about depopulation. This is also known as degrowth, or you'll hear it also called beyond growth. We played some of those clips in our last Armor of Truth Live show.
When we invest in clean energy and electric vehicles and reduce population, more of our children can breathe clean air and drink clean water.
People say, she meant to say reduce carbon dioxide or whatever. No, the goal is to reduce population, and that's what Paul Ehrlich was writing about when they were writing for the Club of Rome 60 years ago. Now, here on this channel, we've covered the Limits to Growth paper from the 1960s, and we've covered for you the book that came out 40 years later, called 2052, by Jorgen Ronders, who they continue and they sort of update their arguments. But let's listen to this. Paul Ehrlich he's the guy. He was the chief of environmentalism, and specifically depopulation.
Seem to be saying that humanity is not sustainable.
No, humanity is not sustainable.
Bizarrely, they featured this man, who has always predicted doom.
We are very close to a famine disaster in the United States.
Why would they treat him like an expert?
Paul Ehrlich may have lived long enough to see some of his dire prophecies come true.
But his dire prophecies, again and again, turn out to be wrong.
In the next 15 years, the end will come. And by the end, I mean an utter breakdown of the capacity of the planet to support humanity.
His bestseller, which sold an amazing 3 million copies, said nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate. That was comically wrong. Today, there are 4 billion more people. The death rate fell dramatically.
Too many people, too much consumption.
60 Minutes did mention that Ehrlich was wrong about widespread starvation, but they take him seriously, never mentioning his other ridiculous predictions, like his claim that by the year 2000, England will not exist because of climate change. But England's still here. Instead of interviewing doomsayers like Ehrlich, 60 Minutes should talk to Marian Tupy, the creator of humanprogress.org.
Everybody is getting richer and longer living, and life is getting better.
It is. The modern era has brought much longer lives and the greatest decline in poverty ever. Young activists think capitalists are destroying the earth.
Millions of people are dying.
So do you want to hitch your wagon to that? I would ask. More of what Ehrlich said. Ehrlich said in 1968 in his bestseller, The Population Bomb, he predicted that the battle... Sorry, let me get this up here. That's going to be hard to read. He said, the battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, the world will undergo famines. Hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked on now. And so what was interesting was that's 1968. In the 1970s, in the mid-70s and the late 70s, it became official United States government foreign policy to depopulate. How? Through certain inoculations. We'll leave that for later. But more specifically, through a global abortion program, birth control program, because it wasn't only birth control they offered, it was access to abortions. So Planned Parenthood has played a major role in this too. All right, so 3 fundamental pillars to the man-made climate change argument. I agree, Gavin, people deserve the truth. Fossil fuel consumption is driving climate change. It must be rapidly eliminated because that's what's going to save these lives. all the evidence indicates that standard of living has increased. We talked about that earlier. CO2 is a greenhouse gas that comes from the use of fossil fuels in farming, shipping, and of course Americans loves for driving their gas-guzzling cars. Third, global average temperature is being driven up by both of these, and over the last 100 years has increased 1.2 degrees Celsius. So in this 1.5 degrees Celsius number that we can't allow to happen, we're already at 1.2 degrees Celsius. Are you trying to tell me that that extra 300ths there is going, that's it? That'll do it. It's just going to, everything's going to boil at that point. And so there are all kinds of assumptions here. We're told that the population boom is bad, and our media ministry here, myself and my wife Summer, we have shown you evidence and proof where our government and experts have engaged directly in this barbaric anti-human policies and programs to reduce population. And so, since there's just not enough time to get into all of it here, we will include for you in the follow-up article that we'll put on Substack for this, we'll include more links than you can shake a stick at, all right? So you can research this for yourself. You'll be able to see that it was official government policy in the 1970s through National Security Memorandum 200 and 314. We'll include those links for you to depopulate. So what is the goal? The goal is to reduce the size of the population and to rescue the earth from white men and capitalism. I'm sorry, but that's the argument. What should our response be? Our response is we need to reduce the size of government, all right? And what must be rescued here is common sense. In 1968, the Club of Rome was founded by Aurelio Pecchii, an international group of renowned scientists, economists, and policymakers to address Earth's sustainability issues. Back then it was cooling, remember? Then it became warming, and whatever's expedient for the day, I guess. In 1972, the Club of Rome produced its most influential work titled The Limits to Growth, a study conducted by a team of researchers at MIT. There you go. There's your experts. That claimed to examine the consequences of exponential population growth, resource depletion, and environmental degradation. The report sparked global debates on sustainability, economic growth, and the balance between human activity and the planet's finite resources. And so Aurelio Pecchii wrote this report here, titled The Chasm Ahead, where he determined a few shocking things. He said, quote, "We now have reached a point where we can contemplate no path other than systematic family planning under the aegis of moral and scientific authorities, and directed possibly by an appropriate international organization." So we need the United Nations to determine how many children we can have. He also said the civilized nations must achieve some measure of birth control in poorer nations. Margaret Sanger called people in developing nations, she called poor people in the United States and in Europe, she called them human weeds, undergrowth. That's the founder of Planned Parenthood. Pecchii says, otherwise drastic measures are inevitable. In any case, what seems indispensable to start with is generalized recognition of facts and their cold logic on the basis of which all or most peoples must unite, and declare that humanity is going to face unprecedented calamity and that everything will get out of control if it cannot reasonably control its numbers. Where's God? What about God? What about the Creator and the one who sustains this place? Pecchii says, what I do know, however, is that a world population plan is pressing and that one day it will come. We must achieve some measure of birth control in a civilized manner, largely by persuasion and education and the diffusion of contraceptives through the responsible decision of the parents and self-rules of restraint. Otherwise, some solution will come the hard way. 3 possible solutions, he says: a biological solution. Nature will fight back and see to it that human incontinence is remedied through some new germ or virus. Constrictive and prophylactic responses. The day may not be far off when by grafting of population from one region to another, forced exodus or mass sterilization, or with the help of other clean methods, biochemistry might suggest a ceiling on population or new births will be enforced, a ceiling, a limit. Again, multilateral institutions or organizations will tell you how many kids you can have. You could pretty much control a nation, couldn't you? Like the United States, you could keep the United States really under your thumb that way. Some nations by due process of law, in others perhaps by international measures. In an essay by Professor J.D. Bernal from October 1967, he said, quote, "There is no limit to human folly and callousness in the sense that all will end as the only compassionate and rational solution left with the elimination of all surplus humans who will, of course, belong to the poor of the world." So, is the climate change argument science? Is it fashion? Is it politics? What is it? The second source I have for you that will settle the issue for you, if you want some settled science. By the way, here's just an example of some of the research that we're doing here. This one is from, of course, this is from the Club of Rome. Yeah, Club of Rome. Summer picked this one up for us the other day. From the Club of Rome, Earth for All, a survival guide for humanity. And of course, what is prescribed here is first of all, inclusivity. Inclusivity is an important part of leading the climate change movement. So Christians, if we're going to lead the climate change movement, we've got to be involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Or be anti-racists, right? Because what anti-racism means is, in fact, discrimination. Of course, I'm not. You hear the word. Are you an anti-racist? Well, sure I am. I don't want to be a racist. But, of course, anti-racism doesn't mean that. It means discrimination against the privileged until the point where we reach equality of outcome, and then we'll pull these laws away. That's communism, and it never pulls away. The dictatorship of the proletariat, it just shifts into the hands of the few again. Based on expert assessments supported by system dynamics models, pathways that bring the most humanitarian, social, environmental, and economic benefits to all. What about valuing our collective future? Millions of children have had to walk out of schools. Listen to this. This is the claim made here by the Club of Rome today. Millions of children, who was this? Yeah, this was Christina Figueres. Someone I thought. Jorgen Reinders is also. Sandrine Dixon de Cleve here. She was. We showed a clip from her last week. Millions of children have had to walk out of schools around the globe and march in the streets to get our attention. Did they? Did they do that really? The kids got together and decided to do that. Okay. Right? The revolution is never bottom up. The revolution is always top down, or it doesn't happen. The school strikers' message is simple. Our house is on fire. The placards on the streets read, systems change, not climate change. And listen to the science. And the youth carrying them are demanding, rightly, a fair and just transition of societies now. So the second source, we read that stuff so you don't have to. But here's the second source, Brian Sussman, meteorologist. So this will be a scientific point of view. I think also Megan Basham's husband is a meteorologist, what I heard her say. So climate cult, exposing and defeating their war on life, liberty, and property. There is no question about it that the climate change movement that we see around us today has its origins in Marxism. We have a video. I'll just, we'll drop it in the description to this video. The title of it is called Climate Cult. I don't remember the number of it right now. In that video, we lay out for you that it starts off with the claim that, April 22nd is the day, the inaugural celebration of a brand new holiday called Earth Day. It just so happens to be also Vladimir Lenin's birthday. In that video, we showed you how Karl Marx was very much influenced by the early environmentalist Professor Justus von Liebig, shared Marx's views on materialism and communism. For the first time, a scientist used his lectern to advance the environmental argument, attacking free markets. That one had to do with bird guano or bird droppings, but Justus von Liebig is the first recorded fellow traveler with a physical science PhD to attack capitalism, and those seeking a better life are guilty of destroying nature. Von Liebig, this was 1862. The idea has been around since at least 1862, so that's along the time with Marx too. Von Liebig is, let's see. In Das Kapital, Karl Marx espoused what he commonly referred to as natural wealth, which he described as fruitful soil, waters teeming with fish and waterfalls, navigable rivers, wood, metal, coal, etc. Marx, like von Liebig, was convinced that such natural wealth did not belong to man, never mind what God said, and could only be utilized if necessary for the absolute common good and without anyone garnishing a profit along the way. So there's von Liebig. So I'll stop short here because this is very interesting, but our video, Climate Cult, will go through this right up into the current moment. It'll take you through von Liebig all the way up through Ehrlich, and draw that unbroken line from Karl Marx to the climate change movement that we're being told we need to lead. We need to get behind it. Science is only as good as two essential elements. First, the logical quality of the reasoning, and second, the quality of the premises, which we've said already for you. As evidence and data are being data being input at the front end of that process. If it's no good, garbage in, garbage out. If one is not responsible with this process, garbage in, garbage out. So follow the science has become code for accept the groupthink, and that is not how science works. Science is a rigorous process that follows a routine method meant to be scrutinized. You can't scrutinize the climate change movement. It's unlikely that the people I would love to hear this won't hear it. Because to scrutinize the movement is to be automatically labeled as a crank. Science begins with a hypothesis, a suggested explanation for an observable phenomenon or a reasoned prediction of a possible causal correlation among multiple phenomena. So it's a process. And it's a process that requires scrutiny. Anthropogenic human-caused climate change advocates contend their theory has reached the critical state of absolute verification. This is what we heard from Gavin earlier. And therefore, profound action must be taken immediately to save the human race. What about carbon dioxide? CO2 is a gas that has historically varied in concentration and only represents a sliver of the overall atmosphere, and contribution to this sliver by humankind's use of fossil fuels is minuscule. If the cause of global warming actually is the emission of carbon dioxide, or CO2, into the atmosphere by way of fossil fuels, a rise in CO2 should precede the rise in temperature. But that's not what is observed in the historical record. Brian Sussman goes on to explain how Dr. Stephen Koonin, former Undersecretary for Science at the U.S. Department of Energy during the Obama administration, said that he has met quite a few colleagues who are privately skeptical of this anthropogenic climate change theory, but they refuse to speak out because, as Megan Basham says in chapter 2 of her book and the other chapters as well, if you speak out against climate change or reproductive rights, or what we call abortion, or the LGBTQ movement, right? Equality, diversity. Well, you'll be shouted down. You're not allowed to point out the inconsistencies. But those leading the masses into the cult would tell you that these people are deniers, people who disagree, outliers, and a distinct minority, as if to imply scientific theory is brought about by consensus. Dr. Fred Singer, Dr. Neil Frank, former director of the National Hurricane Center, Patrick Moore, co-founder of Greenpeace, Dr. John Clauser, mentioned in Megan Basham's book, 22 Nobel Prize winning physicist, Dr. Joel Myers, meteorologist, founder of AccuWeather, John Coleman, founder of the Weather Channel, Dr. Roy Spencer, the late Dr. Bill Gray, Dr. Joanne Simpson, one of the most preeminent scientists of the last 100 years, and the first woman to obtain a PhD in meteorology, says man-made climate change is bunk. Dr. Harrison Schmitt, a Harvard-trained geologist and one of 12 people who have walked on the moon. Also, Willie Soon, an astrophysicist, Richard Lindzen, atmospheric physicist. These people are just cranks. They're conspiracy theorists. They're obviously MAGA, right? Because they don't. No debate is tolerated. And when no debate is tolerated, that's how you get the appearance of consensus. So I would challenge Gavin Ortlund, brother, I challenge you to consider the other side of this. I'm not saying you haven't. It just seems like maybe you haven't. And if I'm wrong about that, I apologize, but I don't know how you could consider this information and then compel other Christians to become a part of this movement. Science is not accomplished by consensus. Sussman goes on here to explain this 1.5 degree mark. I'll finish with this right quick. So how much of the carbon dioxide increased in the atmosphere since the use of fossil fuels began in the early 19th century? Or when we get to the Industrial Revolution, approximately 50%, or half of the thickness of a dime. That's how much carbon dioxide has increased in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution, or before. Half the thickness of a dime. During over 200 years of industrialization, with the population of the planet increasing from approximately 1 billion to 8 billion, with billions of cars, trucks, airplanes, and ships, we all prospered. It got better. It didn't collapse. Anyway, all with engines running on fossil fuels and billions of homes and buildings powered by electricity derived in large measure from natural gas and coal. This pollutive gas, this designer, how did Sussman call it? The designer pollutant. It still remains a sliver. And the increase in carbon dioxide is clearly within historical norms. This dime thickness, again, it would be 1.015 millimeters. 50 million years ago, Sussman uses the same time frame. This is interesting. He uses the same time frame that Gavin was using earlier. Carbon dioxide was likely 6 times higher than it is today. And I'll offer this for Gavin. 90 million years ago, the record would indicate it was as much as 7 times higher. 340 million years ago, if we want to, look, I'm coming into your turf, okay? 340 million years ago, carbon dioxide was thought to be nearly 12 times higher than current levels. The historical record does not bear out extinction events increased by levels of carbon dioxide. So, what's being said here is the connection between carbon dioxide and the warming of the planet, it doesn't follow, not necessarily. He also goes on to talk about the greenhouse effect. There's a lot of speculation about this. It is not a settled issue. So Sussman goes on here to talk about this 1.5 degree number. The most consistent long-term monitoring has been conducted in the United States of global average temperature. It's known as the U.S. Historical Climatology Network, and it includes 1,218 government-sanctioned monitoring stations possessing uniform equipment and guidelines. Most of the site logs contain entries dating back to the 1800s. So if you were to average all the data from these 1,200 plus locations, you would note a mere increase in temperature of about 1/2 degree Fahrenheit since 1900. Let's see. Yeah, I'm trying to skip over some of this because just in the interest of time. Anthony Watts has been doing a yeoman's job in determining how many of the historical networks, these are the weather sites that track temperature, where we get this number, global average temperature. Go to whatsupwiththat.com. Anthony Watts' website, dedicated to sleuthing inaccurate monitoring stations around the world. The point here is that all of now that's just the United States, the 1,200. Many of them were shown to not be reliable. The point is this idea that the global average temperature is increasing, and it doesn't work that way. It might increase. You see more warming in places where it's much colder. And you don't see the kind of warming that they're talking about. You don't see the kind of results. You see fractions. I wasn't going to get into this, but I couldn't help it. This makes it run longer. So I just encourage you to check out and reconsider this idea, because look, there are 3 legs to this argument, 3 pillars that this stands on. Fossil fuels are causing CO2, the CO2 blanket, and this CO2 blanket is causing the atmosphere to warm up. This is highly speculative. It is not a settled science, and to suggest, to encourage, to exhort Christians to get into this movement is to ask Christians to become part of something that is ultimately a deception for a purpose that works against our best interests. So maybe we can come back later. Maybe on True Normal TV we'll do another one where I can just do the data. I probably should have done that here, but I got excited. So let me just say this on the way out. In the biblical context, wisdom flows from a deep and right relationship with God, the fear of the Lord. And so critical thinking contributes to the cultivation of wisdom by enabling spiritual discernment, the pursuit of truth, testing ideas, understanding Scripture, and then engaging in thoughtful reflection. All of these are essential aspects of wisdom. Remember, we're called to be critical thinkers. Proverbs 4:7 says, even if it costs everything, get wisdom, get understanding, seek understanding. So if it costs you your status, if it costs you your reputation, if it costs you friends, if it costs you your family or your job or even your life, the Lord says, get wisdom and seek the Lord while you can. A worldview or an argument or position is incoherent if its foundational beliefs are contradictory, if its logical structure is flawed, if it fails to account for the full range of human experience, or if it cannot be consistently applied in real life. Much of the climate change narrative comes out of the IPCC. Again, this is what Gavin Ortlund and a lot of Catherine Hayhoe and Jonathan Moo, this is what they were referring to as the source. That's where the consensus is. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. So James here in chapter 1, verse 5, encourages believers to seek wisdom from God. Critical thinking and discernment are gifts from God that God will give when we ask without doubting. What does that mean? That means we can't be double-minded. It means we can't be trying to affirm two contradictory positions. Particularly, in this context, what's in view is ideas that are opposed to God's will and the faith. So, do the claims a person is making contradict what is objectively true? Do their presuppositions contradict other beliefs they hold? Internal contradictions? Do they have gaps in their reasoning? 1 John 4:1 says, or the apostle warns us in 1 John 2, chapter 4, to test the spirits. See whether they're from God. And do not accept every teaching at face value, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. And a lot of them are in the United Nations. A lot of them are in your hometown, in your own community right now, too. Presuppositions shape a person's grasp of reality. So what a person believes to be true before they've ever said a word in a debate or dialogue is essential. So in this context, we need to determine whether a person who is stating a position and making claims is offering something as settled science. Are they offering evidence that is clearly open to other interpretations? Because I submit to you that the consensus science is not settled. It's open to interpretation. So we do this because to expose weaknesses in the argument. We don't attack people. We attack the arguments. We tear down the arguments. And we demonstrate that this issue is far from settled. This approach encourages a more nuanced and more open-minded examination of the evidence. And it nourishes a healthy debate and critical thinking. So people everywhere are already wound up. People everywhere are already anxious. I wanted to show you this too before we get out of here. From the book, one of the links in the book. This is the idea, what they're calling this is creation care. That instead of calling it, climate change, they've given it something that that sounds acceptable to Christians. It's called creation care. And so what do we do? I mean, how do we worship in this new way? Well, we have something called the Climate Vigil. We have a worship guide, Climate Vigil songs. Is this necessary, folks? Is this necessary? Do we really think this is something that's necessary? Of course it's not. This is the New America Foundation is one of the groups that Basham identified in her book as one of those groups that is responsible for this influence in the evangelical community. Listen to this for just a second from the New America Foundation.
Just kind of gauging the audience. So what is an evangelical Christian? I tend to forget that I should define it, but we're talking here about 25% of the American population. But not only that, in places like Dallas, Texas, where I live and organize, we're really talking about over 40% of the population being evangelical. And in some districts, you can even have a flat majority of people who are just one evangelical denomination, like Southern Baptist. So this is not an optional curiosity over in the sidelines. We're talking about one of the major groups in American public life. What are the characteristics of evangelicalism? Commitment to the authority of Scripture, to personal conversion, to evangelism, and to actively living out your faith in your everyday life. Evangelical is a broad umbrella category. It includes a lot of different denominations. People argue about who is and isn't an evangelical, but generally the phrase refers to many large denominations, including Southern Baptists, non-denominational Christian churches, whether charismatic or Baptist in origin, the Assemblies of God, now considered evangelical, and then more other denominations like the Presbyterian Church and American Reformed Christians are also often considered evangelical. So I just want to get a sense of who I'm talking to. raise your hand if you have a close friend or a nuclear family member who is an evangelical Christian, or if you yourself are an evangelical Christian. Okay, great, great. So this is a good room, and no judgment, but in a place like Dallas, every single hand in the room would go up, unless I had handpicked a very unusual group of people. It's pretty tightly woven into the fabric of everyday life. But it's not in more liberal spaces, and it's certainly not in the environmental movement. Since the 1980s, evangelicals have been known for their opposition to abortion, to same-sex marriage, and defense of a particular understanding of religious liberty. And they've become tightly intertwined with the conservative movement and with the Republican Party. So one of the most critical voting blocs, if not.
So the assumption there would be that, well, you know, why is that? Can't Christians be Democrats too? Of course they can, but it just so happens that not now, but historically, the Republican Party was more in alignment with traditional conservative, we'll just call them values for now, because they were closer in alignment to biblical Christianity. So what you're hearing here, though, is a talk that's really about we want you to understand that you can be a part of this. It's okay. This is the New America group. This is the group that was responsible for influencing Christians, for directly influencing evangelical leaders to get behind climate change or diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again, this was Jonathan Moo was another name to look out for. I don't know enough to say that Gavin Ortlund would be considered part of all of that. I just think that Gavin Ortlund, as far as I know at this point, is just someone who believes that that climate change is an important issue that we should take seriously. And so I would just encourage Gavin Ortlund to reconsider that. If you want to be a part of, of being good stewardship, caring for the poor, I think our biblical mandate is clear enough that we don't need to be involved with globalist, authoritarian, or groups that want to move us in that direction. Here's a piece from David Hilton. It's titled, "Globalism is Satanic." Globalism in our generation is just as murderous as every other form of political utopianism that humanity has endured throughout the modern period. It has advanced after each world war like it feeds on blood. After World War I came the League of Nations. After World War II came the Western hegemony, or what we call today the elites, who established the United Nations. It's funny because when the United Nations was established, it was the United States, it was China, and it was Soviet Union, all allies in this movement. And it's clear by their provocation of Russia and China that the elites, the Western hegemony, the modern Babylonites are pressing for World War again and have a plan for the post-World War era. Make no mistake, the climate change movement and the narrative is intertwined in everything you're seeing now. It's from the war in Ukraine to what we see. I'm not so sure definitely about Israel and Hamas, but anyway. Before the flood, the mighty prevailed over the meek, and unrighteousness ran amok. In Genesis 11, God commanded and established for mankind to live separated into nations. One reason for the divisions was to curb mankind's pride, to curb mankind's urge for supremacy, to keep it in check. This division into nations was good. It is good because God is good, and by this command he was making a better way for his people. God's world order is for the good of those who are called according to his purpose, according to God's purpose. Romans 8:28. We have some truly terrible men in positions of authority, and they have taken advantage of their position and taken as much as they can with their access to the levers of society and finance. But Scripture is still clear that governments are established by God and that this is done to protect goodness on the earth. Romans 13, 1 through 7. God establishes and deposes kings, Daniel 2. You see here this particular graphic. Julian Huxley, first Director General of UNESCO, said a scientific world humanism, a world government will be necessary for the next stage in human evolutionary progress. One of the major tasks of UNESCO is a restatement of morality that shall be in harmony with modern knowledge. Why do I bring that up? Because that, UNESCO, and that is the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals. That's what they teach. That's what it's a counter religion. Globalism is the attempt of Satan, via his usual method of political utopianism, to destroy this protection that God provides and to bring back the tyranny and wickedness of the pre-flood world. Regardless of whether you agree with that particular eschatological argument, it doesn't matter. The nature of globalism, the nature of these movements, it's clear. It is a secular religion. Christians have no business trying to lead a secular religion. It's a political cult, and it will stack as many bodies as its fanatical true believers feel necessary in order to realize utopia. For the political visionary, heaven on earth is always just one more corpse away. Understand this, if you hear nothing else. When they say the climate change movement is to save lives, please understand that this rapid and radical ending of fossil fuels is going to kill the very people that they say we're all trying to protect. The way you keep poor people around the world, people in developing nations, the way you keep them safe, the way you keep them prosperous is to make sure that the United States remains strong. And of course, that we become active in our local governments and build up a strong community around our churches, and so that we can be involved in our local governments, because that's how we ultimately return this nation to. It's like this. I don't subscribe to make America great again. I think it's way more important that we make America good again. Just good. Globalism is wicked, and globalism is vile, and the spirit behind it wars against God and his people. In short, globalism is satanic. In the journey of faith, whether for an individual, organization, or a nation, the temptation to compromise on core doctrines of Christianity in favor of cultural relevance is subtle but perilous. This incremental process of deviation is often catalyzed by the desire to appease societal pressures. And it echoes the historical shifts that were observed following the Enlightenment, where theologians compromised essential Christian doctrines to maintain relevance in an age of radical empiricism. Right? They tried to, let's fix Christianity so that more people will want to come to it, be a part of it. So let's be seeker sensitive. We need to remain steadfast in the unchanging truths that God has revealed. We need to discern wisely between matters of conscience, matters of Christian liberty, and foundational doctrines that are unbendable and unbreakable. Compromise is the process by which a person, an organization, or nation moves from faithfulness into error, and it rarely happens suddenly. It's usually gradual erosion of conviction. And it comes in 6 steps: ignoring evil, permitting evil, and then legalizing the evil, just like abortion has happened. We ignored it, then it was just permitted, then it was legal. Same thing with gay marriage. They call it gay marriage. It's not marriage. 4th, then we start promoting the evil. 5th, we celebrate the evil. And lastly, we start persecuting anyone who challenges our evil. That mirrors the warning we see in Isaiah 5:20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. When a culture or a church redefines evil as good, it invites God's judgment and then forfeits its moral and spiritual authority. And I suggest that's what we see. And so in the face of these pressures, we have to stand firm on these eternal, unchanging truths that God has revealed. And that requires in us a clear understanding of which doctrines are essential to the faith and which are matters of Christian liberty or conscience. The Apostle Paul provides a model for this in his letters to the early churches, where he distinguishes between essential doctrines like the resurrection of Christ and disputable matters like dietary laws and holy days. We have to be rooted in Scripture right now, not in the United Nations, not in the IPCC consensus science. We have to be rooted in Scripture, guided by the Holy Spirit, informed by the teachings of the church throughout history, the creeds, the confessions of the church. These are our tools for discerning truth in the core doctrines of the faith. These are where we get our collective wisdom, or where the church's collective wisdom comes from. This is our framework for resisting pressures to compromise. And we have to cultivate a deep love for the truth. We have to know how to identify it. We have to be willing to suffer for it if necessary. The martyrs of the early church who refused to renounce their faith, even in the face of death, these serve as our powerful example of what it means to stand firm in the truth. Their witness reminds us that the cost of discipleship is high, but the reward is eternal. So as the world continues to call evil good and good evil, and these movements crop up and try to compromise us, we have to resist this temptation to conform. We have to trust the unchanging truth, the power of God to sustain us through these trials. Isaiah's words are both a warning and a reminder. Those who compromise with evil ultimately invite God's judgment, but those who remain faithful will be vindicated in the end. And that's our blessed hope, that on that day, Christ returns in glory, that we would be found faithful. God bless you, my friends. We'll see you next time.
The hammer comes down and beats you over the head for the rest of your life with a big national security stick. And so that people learn to duck their head and not speak up. Because bad idea now.
This is the emergency broadcast system. This is not a test. Repeat, this is not a test. Citizens are advised to take the following steps.
Find us, armoroftruth.net.
In the age of technocracy, scientism, would take humanity to new heights, to create a new world order.
Find us at the Armor of Truth YouTube channel.
This is not a test. Repeat, this is not a test.